Hello, everyone. My name is Bruce Lynn. I'm one of the managing partners of the Financial Executives Consulting Group. We've got people logging on as we speak, so we're going to start the main body of our conversation in a couple of minutes. Myself and Matt Knoll will be sort of leading the charge, talking about factoring. And hopefully you will learn a few things. We're going to try to make this as interactive as possible. So I will be turning on people's microphones in a couple of minutes. We'll give Matt a chance to start, and then we'll take some questions. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to mute myself and let some people log on, and we're going to start here in about 2 minutes. All right, good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who have just signed in, my name is Bruce Lynn. I'm one of the managing partners of the Financial Executives Consulting Group. We're going to start the main body of the presentation now. And we have Matt Knoll, senior manager from E&Y, who is going to sort of lead the conversation. But I like to make this as interactive as possible. So if you do want to say something, I've got the microphones muted at the moment. But if you do want to say something, you can use the raise my hand button, and I will turn on all the mics, and you can talk to Matt directly. So Matt, why don't you start the conversation?
Thanks, Bruce. I very much appreciate being invited to lead a discussion here. We have nine attendees total, and we'll go for probably close to the full hour. The agenda is pretty loose, but we have it up on the slide. And first, I'll just introduce myself. So, like Bruce said, I'm Matt Knoll. I'm a senior manager in the strategy and transactions practice of Ernst & Young. I'm based in the New York office. I have been at Ernst & Young for just about 4.5 years. And prior to that, I had a career in the rating agencies. I worked for Moody's Investor Service for 8 years. I was a credit rating advisor at Morgan Stanley, and I was a asset-based lender at Citibank prior to joining Moody's. And also going way back, I served in the US Navy, and also worked in Silicon Valley after the Navy. I've been here in the New York metro area working in and around Wall Street for 20 years. And I would say that my my experience with factoring specifically has been through the work that I've done with banks. Most of my clients are banks and often credit officers at banks. And I've one of the clients that I have is a trade organization that covers asset-based lending, factoring, supply chain finance, and I completed a market sizing and impact study for that client several years ago. And that was for me, as kind of a person with a lot of research background, somebody who really studies the capital markets and just markets broadly, was really a fantastic experience. Even having been an asset-based lender, going back to the early 2000s and kind of seeing that form of financing, I, candidly had recognized I had a lot to learn about factoring, and the market, is really a pretty fascinating one, and one that I'm hoping that I'm going to learn a few things myself from some of you all here over the course of this discussion. I really strongly encourage folks to speak up. I mean, we're a small group here. We're all doing this for various reasons. But first and foremost, I want it to be educational and enjoyable, something where I came away from this and I learned something new. So I figure we're going to talk, and Bruce, you may have more to say about this, but we're going to kind of go into our agenda items that are up on the board. So kind of where does factoring fit in the financing strategy is going to be the first kind of area that I'd like to drive into. And so maybe before we get to any of our polling questions, I will pull up on those along the way here. But first and foremost, I'd like to just understand from anybody that's on this call, or if nobody's going to speak up, Bruce, you're going to be put on the spot. I'd just like to hear some points of view about where factoring potentially fits within your overall financing strategy. And so, again, when I'm asking that question, I'm asking the question from the perspective of the treasurer, the CFO, somebody within a finance department who is a client of a factor. I will shift plenty for those that might be on the call that might be from factoring companies, where you're having the perspective from the factor. We're going to have plenty of time to also kind of open up the floor for your perspectives. But for right now, we'll start from the perspective of the factor's client, which is a business that is utilizes factor financing in some shape or form. So I'd just like to hear anybody's kind of perspective on where factoring kind of fits. Is it 100% of your financing? Is it much smaller? Are you just considering it, potentially using factoring as a form of liquidity management? Floor is open for anybody who wants to jump in.
Okay, I've unmuted people's phones, so if you do want to say something, please and just announce yourself and unmute your phone by pushing *6.
By the way, I have zero visibility on who's on this call, so you can keep yourself completely anonymous. Although Bruce, you're the ultimate moderator here.
Sure.
But if folks would feel better about just keeping anonymity, I fully respect that.
Okay.
So,
go ahead.
So this is Vinny Fabia. I'll jump in and tell you that we are not using factoring, but I'm on this call to find out more because I'd like to consider it as part of our strategy.
Okay, great. Anybody else want to chip in? Is anybody really a very active user of factoring?
If you're having trouble, just click the raise my hand button here, and I will
yes or no.
Unmute you.
This may be off topic, but what's the difference between factoring and merchant cash advances?
That's going to get right to almost my first polling question. But I think so. I'm going to have an operating presumption that the kind of overall knowledge of the factoring universe. I've certainly met some of the folks at CIT and big factoring firms who are extraordinarily knowledgeable on the market. But I'm going to just operate on the presumption that we have just kind of okay to average. Even I'll candidly say my knowledge of factoring is I'm better suited to maybe help facilitate a discussion as opposed to kind of a really hardcore lead a factoring discussion. But I think that question that was just posed about merchant cash advance versus factoring is an incredibly, I think it touches on a broader topic, which is the definitions around factoring and what the terminology is, what the terms are, what the various meanings are, is a massively critical thing. I come from a lending background where I make a loan to somebody, it's, say a $10 million loan, and it might amortize over time. It's got a certain interest rate associated with, floating or fixed. All of that kind of grounding that we may have, and that's all stuff that too, if you're in your finance 101 class or in accounting, you're going to think about financing in those terms. Factoring is, really different. And one of the first things that makes classic definition of factoring different is that it's not really even a loan. It's really the purchase of an accounts receivable. And that purchase, has certain, there's credit implications around how that is differentiated from, say, a bank note. And as it comes to like merchant cash advance, I'm going to yield right now to anybody else on the floor who might want to talk about merchant cash advance a little bit. And if nobody wants to speak up, I think I'd like the person who asked the question to give the context around their question a little bit more. So is anybody a merchant who uses cash advance? Anybody a supplier of merchant cash advance?
Just unmute yourself if you want to speak.
Do we have any factors on the call who work with a lot of merchants? Okay. So let's pick apart, again, I went into a little, the main focus here is factoring. So, and I said that factoring is the purchase of receivables. So usually, I think what's really critical to kind of recognize is that when a client of a factor, and the factor is the supplier of the financing, and the client is the receiver of that service, and that client also has many customers. And so if I am a business and I have certain customers, and I have created, I've made certain sales to my customers have perhaps 90 days to pay me. I've got an accounts receivable that's open. So, just round numbers, $1,000 is kind of my open AR. And what I'm gonna, what I have an opportunity to do to work with my factor is say, hey, factor, would you like to purchase that 1,000 AR that I have? And in return for, that purchase, I get immediate cash up front, as opposed to waiting potentially up to 90 days for my customer to pay me. So I just wanted to level set on some really basic. There's a couple other key terms. There's something called recourse factoring, and there's also something called notification in factoring, which again are technical points. Merchant cash advance, what's the difference, perhaps, if anybody can kind of answer, what's the difference between what I just described as a classic factoring arrangement and merchant cash advance?
Isn't a merchant cash advance, the wherewithal to repay the advance is based on future sales versus factoring? It's a historical sale or a current sale contemporaneous with the factoring? Was that part of it?
That sounds pretty accurate to me. I think that the key, that particularly those that have worked in kind of a manufacturing environment, if you've worked in manufacturing and you ship product, once it leaves the kind of the dock and goes out, you can often at that point actually call it a sale. If it hasn't left the dock yet, it hasn't. And then further, you could have also have folks, well, that piece of equipment needs to actually arrive at your customer's, place of business. And there's a lot of, so the AR might be created the moment that the something leaves the dock, but you've got this piece of equipment potentially sitting in a truck for a week as it travels across country or something like that. And then it needs to be, successfully actually delivered and received and accepted by the customer. When I describe a classic factoring, I generally, I'm a credit guy by background, so what I want to know, if I'm providing financing in a classic factoring form to my client, I want to know that AR that I'm purchasing from the client, that piece of, whatever it is, has it left the dock? Well, yes, it better have left the dock. Has it actually been received by the customer? I hope so. Is the customer not going to return that piece of equipment, and so forth? So merchant cash advance, I think to the speaker's point, I may be a business and I have various merchants, or there may be merchants out there who need money sooner than what they've even potentially delivered their product to a customer. So my first question, if you look up on the board, I don't know if you guys can see the poll questions, is terms and technical talk, the difference between factoring and invoice financing. I'm not, again, I think the merchant cash advance question is kind of related to the same technical point. What's the difference between AR and an invoice? And can I potentially finance somebody on an invoice? And what do I mean by invoice? So let's say I'm a business, I'm a construction company, and I'm an electrical contractor, and I'm going to provide electrical services work and installation work to an office building in Manhattan. I receive from the building or contractor an invoice. It says I'm ordering $1 million worth of your services, and I want those to be delivered over the course of April 30th to June 30th. So I have a piece of invoice. Today's what, March 13th. I have an invoice to do this work in the future. I'm not getting paid. I might not be getting paid. I might get paid 1/3 up front, 1/3 in the middle, and 1/3 at the end. Or I could take my invoice, my piece of paper that I have here, and I can give it over to the factor and say, hey, I'm going to be providing services. Can you pay? This is a $1 million invoice. Can I get $950,000 from you right now? I don't want to wait till June 30th to get my final payment. So the big distinction between the AR purchase and the invoice financing is that the invoice might represent services that have not been delivered, have not been executed, have not, so the factor's taking on more risk. And so the nature of the risk is quite different. So I think it's just really important for those that are trying to learn a little bit more about factoring is it's really critical to orient yourself around what does client mean? Am I the client? What's the factor? We call them the factor. Who are the customers? Where the cash flows go? Where are the timing of the cash flows? And have goods and services been ordered, or have goods and services been manufactured? Have goods and services been delivered? Am I well past the point in which my customer could potentially return the goods and services and so forth? So there is a life cycle of going from somebody making an order, somebody making goods, performing services or manufacturing a good, and then moving on to the completion of the products, the delivery of the products, the acceptance of the products. And so it's very important that for those that are kind of educating themselves on factoring, and particularly might be wanting to get into the business of factoring, to really understand what are the terms and conditions of the payments between the client and their customers. What are the timings of those payments that going back? How much flexibility is in there? And they can also get into, okay, well, if I'm a factor and where am I getting my money paid back? I paid the electrical contractor $950,000. And let's say, come September, I haven't seen anything back. Do I go after the electrical contractor, or do I go after the building person who actually provided the invoice to the electrical contractor, and so forth? So I'm hopeful that this discussion peels back the onion a little bit on some of the layers of complexity and why these questions about factoring, merchant cash advance, reverse factoring, invoice financing, all of these things can mean different things to different people. And it's very easy to get turned sideways very quickly, particularly when you're new to it and you're talking to somebody who you maybe presume is truly highly knowledgeable and knows all the stuff, and they're talking a lot of fast talk, and you're just going, okay, you're nodding politely. So can I get any other reactions, thoughts? Anybody else want to talk about merchant cash advance? I hear that term quite a bit in my in my work, and so it is it's a considerable opportunity for finance providers, lenders, factors to potentially be offering that. But I would say that merchant cash advance and factoring in a classic sense are two different things, or can be so. Any other thoughts on any of that?
Go ahead, you can unmute yourself if you like. You want to ask Matt a question?
Don't be bashful.
Yep. All right, let's move on.
Okay. So I already kind of hit the second, well, we kind of hit the second polling question a little bit, which is, I think there's some on the call that are probably somewhat new to the idea of factoring. And I think, a big question that's kind of gone on in my mind, this is really polling questions 2 and 3. We'll kind of bang them both out. But we heard one person say that they're kind of considering factoring. Is there anybody who's, actually been engaged in a factoring exchange of any form, either as a factor or as a client of a factor, in the last year? I'd just be curious. Anybody? It's pretty simple, yes or no. Can I get a couple yeses or a couple nos? If you answer yes, I'm going to ask you the question, are you considering using more factoring potentially? Anybody? Okay. I'd be curious to hear whether anybody thinks COVID-19 has had any influence on factoring, opportunities, or I want to actually, I'll do some talking here first to kind of tee this up a little bit more. Why is the COVID-19 question here? Factoring, by and large, is used by small businesses. I mean, there are large businesses that do it for sure, but usually, if you're a business, and it could be any size business really, but again, middle market and smaller generally, the cash flows to run your business get a little bit or unfavorable for how you'd like them to be. You may have a big order to manufacture sweaters for next winter, but you're not going to get paid for the delivery of those sweaters. But in the meantime, you have to go out and you have to buy a lot of yarn, and you don't. If you don't have the money right now to buy the yarn, how are you going to make the sweaters to then deliver them this fall when the stores want lots of sweaters? So anyway, it's small businesses that contend with this. And small businesses, what's the one thing that every small business owner in this country has a new acronym that they've gotten to know very well in the last 12 months? Anybody want to take a guess at what that
PPP loans
is?
or CARES or COVID?
PPP. Yeah, Paycheck Protection Program. Actually, the bulk of my work over the last year has actually been on Paycheck Protection Program. And it's really supporting lenders in standing up their units to deliver PPP loans. And I would say if you would have asked me how many small businesses there are in the country, you're going to get an answer anywhere from about 7 million up to about 30 million. 30 million would include kind of all the sole props, all the kind of people that just are barely even a business. They just kind of earn some money. 7 million, that actually is closer to the number that you might have like 1 or 2 employees. They're actually an LLC or they're incorporated. They've been around for a while. So, and of that, say 7 million, or again, on the high end, you could say maybe it's 30 million. The Paycheck Protection Program through the first round had provided 5 million PPP loans to small businesses. And in the second round of PPP, you probably got another 3 or so million more loans that have been dispersed. So the penetration of this money and the amount of contact that these small businesses have now had with their lenders has been pretty profound. And that's going to continue to be for 2021 as more of those PPP loans get forgiven. In my estimation, the PPP kind of for many businesses was looked at very, very favorably. And I think potentially has been arguably transformative. Again, I can't really strongly assert this, but I do sense that a lot of small businesses who would typically be good factoring customers have now gotten a taste of the liquidity of a small business administration loan. And I think that a lot of them really like that warm water coming all over them. And I think that they probably are thinking about financing avenues more so. And why? Again, it's because they've gotten more of a relationship with their bank. They've gotten money. They certainly have experienced the shock and awe of what COVID-19 was. I don't even if you're a grocery store and you're up 60% of last year, the fact that your business can be turned upside down in literally a week is frightening for a lot of small business owners, for sure. And I think that it has further advanced digitization. It's further I just don't think there's many people that kind of conclude the year we've just been through without looking at the world a little bit differently. And I think that will extend to how you finance yourself. So I would have a view that factoring as an opportunity set on balance may be higher today than what it was pre-COVID. That's just my intuition. I could be totally wrong. I would welcome, again, going back to the third question here on my polling questions, has the pandemic helped create businesses, help business growth opportunities for factors? So taking it from the factor view, I could also ask the same question: is COVID-19 impacted or increased the potential need for a small business to consider factoring or merchant cash advance or invoice financing or some other form of trade finance as part of its overall financing? Does anybody want to express any views on that? Bruce, let me ask you, in your travels with the treasurers and the CFOs and where are you seeing, if at all, any increase or decrease in, and we can even keep it more broad than factoring, it could be just financing in general. Is your average treasurer these days really dusting off the playbook on bank relationships, financing opportunities? What are your thoughts?
Well, you've got two cases, obviously. You've got sort of, I'll call the public case and the private case. The public companies, usually those are ones with a Treasury Department. They have a lot of alternatives. They often borrow on what I'll call unsecured terms. So they have nothing to do with receivables at all. They just basically full faith and credit on their cash flow. But you do have companies that are what's the term, liquidity challenged, and they will have secured lending. And let me reveal my ignorance about this whole process, that factoring and secured lending are different, but I couldn't tell you exactly what the main differences are, and maybe I'll defer to some others on the phone here. But certainly with factoring, you have a situation where it's looked on as really very onerous, not only the price, but the terms. So factoring, while an alternative, and again, please someone else correct me, is a little further down on the what I need to do to secure liquidity for my firm, because people would rather obviously borrow unsecured or borrow on their cash flow, maybe secure, but factoring again seems to be a little lower down. Others with different opinions, please speak up.
Hi, Bruce. Hi, Matt. This is Linda. I can offer an opinion here.
Great.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I used to sell off my AR. I used to factor. It's been like probably 7+ years ago. I transitioned then over into private equity, and I was heading up a turnaround project for private equity, and that factoring was much more I guess, a part of a solution in the private equity world, because you need to get your AR cleaned up, you want to sell it off, and you need cash, right? So those were the incentives to look at factoring. But then when you dug deeper into it, and this is probably 1, 2, 3 years ago, the cost of factoring was just prohibitive. It didn't make sense to factor off because we just lost too much off the top of it. And I think nowadays, with all the bots that you can dump on your AR, like having all the dunning letters, everything automated, that a lot of companies are just getting away from factoring, and they're just, relying on the automation, digitalization, to chase up AR, more so in the company landscape. So I'm not really hearing too much, from a CFO perspective, I'm not hearing too much anymore around the factoring concept. Now, if I flip onto the other side of things, the company I work for now as CFO, we actually buy distressed debt portfolios, right? So if a bank is looking to impair their credit cards so they can't collect on them, we'll buy that distressed debt and we'll collect on it. And so we're on the other side, we're buying those portfolios. So a different perspective for me, and I can see where, we can make a lot of money on that side of the fence. So, that's kind of why I signed up for today, because I'm not seeing that factoring is that prominent in the industry much these days. And so I'm interested to hear what other folks on the call or other companies are really, doing around the factoring arena. Hope that helps, Matt and Bruce.
That was fantastic. And I think those points are very much resonate and actually thoroughly kind of also under, to the extent that we, I talked through a thread that kind of said that, there's more opportunities for factoring out there. But I think that there may be more opportunities for financing, not so much just factoring. But anybody else want to have any responses to the comments about the opportunity set out there?
Well, the reason I asked the question about the difference in factoring and merchant cash advance is I was a consultant for a merchant cash advance company that is actually run by a crook. I mean, he changed his name after he was told by the SEC that he couldn't continue doing what he was doing. But one of the people, and I knew nothing about merchant cash advance when I got there, and one of the people I was talking to said basically, none of these people who we're advancing money to need us. What they need is a cash flow expert who can say, look, you have a chance of surviving without going to a merchant cash advance company where, for the best customers, we were charging interest. It's not an interest rate because it'd be illegal to call it an interest rate. But I mean, we would, if you calculate, and APRs fall apart when the numbers get big. But the APRs went from 60% to 500% a year. Borrow $100,000 and then pay me $140,000 over the next 140 business days. And I'm sorry, I advance $100,000 and then repay that advance $1,000 a day for the next 140 days is outrageous. And so many people, so many of their customers ended up going bankrupt because they had problems that just a one-time short-term cash flow fix wouldn't help. And so I was really wondering what, when factoring is factoring, and forgive me for getting nasty here, but I mean, is factoring legitimate? Excuse me. Or is it just for people who are desperate? Anyway, that's the end of my monologue. I apologize.
We get any follow-ups to that? Those thoughts?
Yes. Am I being heard?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. I didn't get all of the last comment, but I think I got enough of it. So I think you know, I've spent most of my career in the world of asset-based lending, right? Otherwise known, and I could see there's a lot of different types of asset-based lenders. They're more traditional asset-based lending groups that are part of commercial banks, and then you see some other ones that are more like, you know, privately held, smaller finance companies that are more aggressive. They take more risks. It's kind of like going down market in asset-based lending. You tend to pay more in interest. They take greater control of your business, of your cash flows. But they, you know, there's a reason for that. But factoring, you know, it's so sometimes you would think that factoring is going even further down market, right, from asset-based lending. But factoring doesn't really have to be like that, and it's really no different than asset-based lending. As far as the credibility of the product, there's what I've seen is that it's a lot more nimble, right? It's a lot more nimble than an asset-based lending. When you go into a factoring arrangement, you can get it done quicker than you would necessarily get an ABL written, because there's more due diligence. It's more onerous, just the process. I represented a supply chain company that went from it's with the same bank. They stay with the same bank. However, they went from being in their middle market lending group or commercial lending down to ABL. And it was like, you know, almost doing an asset acquisition. It was just the due diligence process was incredible, and it took a lot of time and money. So it seems to me that factoring might cost more, but one of the benefits that you're really getting is that it's a lot more nimble, easier to close a factoring transaction than an ABL transaction, and that's why, you know, I've worked in many situations where there's been factoring arrangements, but I was only in a consulting situation. I've never been in a situation where we actually, you know, acquired factoring financing. So that was just my 2 cents. I just wanted to add a couple things there.
Thanks for that perspective. I think those points resonate. I mean, there's really two things. The one, we had a little bit of a discussion there about the distinctions between factoring and ABL and kind of where those two are kind of positioned, kind of on a kind of a company maturity. You know, you're probably going to be a larger, more mature company if you're using ABL financing than you would be if you're using some form of factoring financing. And the kind of speed to kind of execution, factoring is going to be faster than ABL. You know, the ABL, which again is financing kind of generally based on fully secured AR and or inventory, you know, is going to be, and it's usually a revolving credit facility, and it's, you know, you know, in true ABL, you would actually calculate a borrowing base, and you would have formal appraisals of your AR and your inventory, field exams. You know, you're really, it's truly a credit line that is being offered to you, and you can draw down on it as much as you like, so long as you're borrowing, you know, you're staying within the borrowing base. So the kind of you know, it's more complex, but it's also probably offers more flexibility in many regards, but it's far more on terms of monitoring. Factoring, again, you know, I don't know how many factors will just factor a single AR. You know, usually you want to, there's going to be questions about, are we going to be providing you factoring for the entirety of your AR? Is it going to be just AR from certain customers? You know, and whether or not it's this recourse or non-recourse, in other words, does the factor have recourse back to the client, or do they not have recourse back to the client? these things can, probably they're important, but honestly, having been an ABL lender and kind of looked at, I'm really thinking about the syndicated, Citi or JP Morgan or Fifth Third doing ABL lending is a huge business for them, and it's really done with can be done with huge companies. Can be done with small companies too, but generally, these are middle market and above, as opposed to middle market and below, where factoring is for. But I think I want to also just go back to the private equity contributor, and the point, because it's this does kind of follow the agenda here. I wanted to talk a little bit about technology, client experience, and there's some data points I kind of want to get into in the discussion. But does anybody else have any further follow-ups that they want to have on the point that factoring, because of its, it's a very, in many regards, an old form of financing, and many of those factors maybe still operating on kind of an old school approach, and yet as technology has evolved, the ability for a lot of big companies to offer pretty attractive financing terms potentially that might disintermediate where the factor might have previously played. I'd be curious to hear if anybody is working with or seen a fintech company that, or any type of, large company that is providing greater flexibility. This would be a B2C kind of arrangement, business to commercial business, and the commercial business as the customer is being provided, more flexibility. So you could imagine, it could be a situation like Amazon, in order to attract a particular seller onto their website, Amazon might be providing some form of financing to the seller in order to kind of keep them at the Amazon table, so forth. Is anybody seeing that and wants to maybe offer a point of view on that? To the private equity person who, I'm sorry, I can't see anybody's names.
That's okay, Matt. It's Linda. Yeah, I'm here. So I was just going to chime in on that. The only place that I've really seen like this incentive, if you will, is like in the e-commerce space. So sometimes you have like an e-commerce platform that will develop like the API, the technology behind it, hand in hand with their partners. That's kind of an incentive. So we'll keep the partner engaged in our business by developing the API that, connects the two technologies together. And we'll do that free of charge by you having, X business with us. That's really based on the example you just gave. That's the only thing that came to mind. In the PE space, I didn't see any other. Are there any other incentives that you were mentioning? Unfortunately, sorry.
Cool. Thanks, Linda. I know we have just 10 minutes left, and we don't have to go to the full 10. We'll give everybody a little potentially relief before the 4 o'clock calls come up. I would really be curious to hear if anybody has any insights on factoring data, or really just specialty finance. What I mean by specialty finance, I mean trade finance, or who and I'm selfishly asking this as kind of a market researcher and somebody who, wants to be able to provide strategic advice about this, but to make really informed decisions about what's happening in the market, I find it quite challenging to be able to kind of size up the volume of factoring transactions, the volume of invoice financing, the volumes of supply chain finance. These there's a tremendous amount of activity out there that if a bank's doing it, it's all going to get potentially tucked into a commercial and industrial loan category. If it's a non-bank that's doing it, well, it's almost totally undetectable. And anybody have any trade organizations, any trade magazines, any websites that have been kind of really strong sources of informing you as a market participant? I'd be curious if anybody has any things they want to share in that regard. If anybody has the view that there is truly a dearth of good information out there on this market, and it's somewhat of a dark space, I'd be curious if anybody wants to affirm that view or say, nope, Matt, you need to be looking here, you need to be looking there, you need to be kind of seeing this. I'd welcome opinions on that.
Matt, this is Linda. I can offer up that I found some factoring data with BL Paribas and with JP Morgan. This was in the Asia Pac region. I'll take a look back to see if I still have it. And I think I even had I had 3 sources of factoring data, and they were all linked to big banks, big banks. I'll see if I can still find that and share it with you through Bruce.
And just so, if anybody wants, I would reach out to me. I personally conducted or assisted, again, an organization on sizing the factoring market in the United States. So I technically should be the guy who, and I'll tell you, it was a real challenge to do that. But I have some experience. I have been in touch with all the 3 largest factors in the United States. But thanks, Linda. I would be curious to see maybe what that is. But anybody else have any other views? I would only
offer that the ABL markets are so much larger that people would rather play in the larger markets, and because of that, the ABL market is more standardized. I think that's part of the problem, is that factoring, and I don't know whether it's a chicken and egg situation, factoring is so specific that because it's so specific, it's difficult to liquefy, and because it's difficult to liquefy, it is not a large market. And the ABL markets are larger because of the standards that have been adopted. And when you go way back to the time in which banks actually held on to their loans, the bank would make you a loan, based on whatever it is that you like.
Yeah.
But over the years, banks found out that, why am I holding these loans? But to sell them, there had to be some standards. So the more standard they became, the more they were able to liquefy them. And so factoring is, I think, in some ways stuck, unless they adopt some sort of standards.
Well, I have a theory, Bruce, that ABL's strength, and ABL's a fairly classically American form of financing. You won't find the depth of the ABL market over in Europe or Asia, but you will find a much deeper factoring market over in Europe and Asia than you will ABL. So it's the success of the ABL product in the United States, which is potentially attributable the strength of U.S. bankruptcy laws and the flexibility of U.S. bankruptcy laws that have allowed ABL as a product over the decades to emerge as a kind of a more advanced and more a deeper form of financing relative to factoring. Yeah, just an observation. And so, yeah, if you really, is there a single trade organization in the United that's American based that is dedicated to factoring and factoring solely? There are trade organizations that certainly have a lot of factors as part of their members, and they consider the factoring constituency to be very important. But I am not aware of a organization in the United States that is dedicated exclusively to the factoring business and being the voice of factors in the United States. And I think that is a detriment to the factoring business on balance. It would be better to have a stronger voice on legislative matters, on organizing standards and so forth. But yeah, and there's a lot of other trade organizations that do a lot of work with factors, but they're often also looking at more than just factoring. So
I'm also wondering whether, and this is again, I defer to anybody else on the phone here, but the whole idea of sale of an AR, in which is factoring truly a sale, and you get into that problem of recourse, because if it's not really a sale, you're still on the hook for it. So from a credit perspective, yes, you got cash, but at the end of the day, who's taking the risk? And that can influence a company, because while it's off their balance sheet and maybe they look good, but one day it comes back on, and then before you know it, that company is not looking so good. So is factoring really a solution to the problem? If the problem is I need cash now, I guess you take what you can get. But at the end of the day, the person who bought it, if it turns out to be worthless, then you end up later on being worse off than I think than before you started factoring.
I mean, there's no question that nobody's going to win in a if there's a failure to perform, a failure of a customer, of the client to pay. But I do think that factoring for those companies that really need liquidity, need flexible liquidity, I think factoring is a very legitimate possibility, and does offer, I think, probably greater flexibility than somebody that would going down the ABL route. Yeah, I just wonder if there's a lot of other, like, I think the point that was made, like, well, if factoring is going to mean that I'm going to literally on every transaction 5% of the sales that I'm going to I have to, like, 5% of my sales is being kind of hived off because I lose that to the factoring discount. It can create some tough questions if you convert that 5% into kind of an APR terms, and oh my God, it starts. It can be tough. There's a lot of math, I think, that has to be considered behind these things. All right. Well, Bruce, should we? I know it's coming up. It's 4 o'clock now, so I want to respect everybody's time. And Bruce, you want to conclude?
Yes, I think that obviously as the markets shift, hopefully for the better, as the pandemic loosens its grip on the U.S., maybe the idea of how best to finance yourself will change. And I think that what I'd like to suggest is the people on this call, and obviously others who didn't make the call, could try to think about how best to keep themselves up to date. And the first thing I would suggest is they could certainly go back to people on this call And the second thing is FENG in general has got a lot of expertise out there. And obviously Matt's shared some of it, some of his with you. But if there are other questions that come up, not only on factoring, but other sources of financing or trade finance in general, I think Matt is certainly the place to go. And maybe that's just to think about that as the business conditions change. Well, Matt, thank you very much for taking your time to spend some time with us and talk about factoring. And I hope people on the call learned something. I certainly did. And maybe we'll reconvene again in a month's time.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Bruce.
Okay, thank you. And so with that, I'm gonna turn off the conversation, and we'll see each other soon. Thank you all.
Thank you.